Paul Wearne attends the Christadelphian Church or ecclesia that meets at the Eastern Suburbs area in Perth, Australia. Recently, Paul has been doing some work on Bible translations, and he seeks to answer some basic questions such as, can we trust modern translations? Are translations biased? Is there a particular translation that we should use? And are all modern translations essentially equal? Paul joins us on Wilderness Conversations. Paul, thanks very much for joining Wilderness Conversations.
And thanks for having me, Steve.
The subject of Bible translations is a really interesting one and obviously a really important question as we're talking about the inspired Word of God. All Scripture is breathed by God, 2 Timothy 3:16, well-known verse. Also 2 Peter 1 verse 21, no prophecy was ever produced by the will of man, but men spoke from God as they were carried along by the Spirit. So a really important subject.
Yeah. It's something that I've been pretty passionate about. I've been passionate about translations for a long time, and I've sort of dug a bit deeper more recently. And the more digging you do, the more fascinating it is. But and even in addition to those quotes you mentioned, there's one that says, "And we impart this in words not taught by human wisdom, but taught by the Spirit." That's 1 Corinthians 2:13. And the point is it's talking about words. So one of the things that comes up in the discussion with translations is it just the words or is it the gist? Is that okay?
Right.
And it's clearly the words are important. It's inspired word of God, and it's not the general thrust, because there's translations out there that give what they think is the general thrust and can get it terribly wrong at times.
I'm interested in the Paul's reference to Melchizedek. So in fact, you can go a step further and say it's not just the words, it's even when it doesn't talk about words. So, his father and mother wasn't mentioned, so therefore he's an everlasting, the everlasting priesthood, because his father and mother is not mentioned. So it's almost another level of the words are important, but even what words aren't there is important.
What's not said.
Which is amazing.
Yeah.
I guess if it wasn't for Paul, we probably wouldn't have made that assumption, but we get that insight from Paul.
Yeah, a bit of inspired commentary.
Yeah. I guess the other thing is too, you've got, obviously the ideas are inspired, but then the words are important. And then something I've become more interested in the last, few years is the structure of the way it's presented. So, and particularly in, like the Torah, the very structure teaches a lesson. So you've got all these levels.
Yeah.
The message, the words that aren't there, if you like, and then the way it's put together is indeed inspired as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that sort of when I'm looking at this, you look at what is our teaching on the Scripture, and our statement of faith. Very opening clause is the book currently known as the Bible is wholly given by inspiration. So that sort of underpins every other doctrine. So of all the doctrines that we could possibly believe, that is the underpinning one in which all the others stand or fall. And the statement of faith wisely says that, this translation doesn't say this translation is inspired. It's very specific. It says is without error, except where due to errors of transcription or translation. And they're the sort of things that become relevant when looking at translation. So,
all right, well, let's stop and pause there for those who may not have sort of noticed it before. So we're suggesting, the statement of faith says that the Bible's inspired, and so the only area that there may be errors is where there may be errors due to transcription or translation. So would you like to define what they are?
Yeah, so transcription is when manuscripts are transcribed from one manuscript to the next. They wear out. So now we have printing press, and you can pretty well guarantee, photocopier, you can guarantee that one text is absolutely the same as the next one. Back in the day, before the printing press, Gutenberg, 1500 and something, every single manuscript, every single book was written and rewritten, giving rise to the possibility of errors, which I will add surprisingly few given how long the Old Testament and the New Testament have been described for and how many copies there are, because we don't have the original copies. We don't have what John wrote. It's called, the technical term is the autographs. We don't have the autographs. The earliest copy we have might be 5 generations down from what John actually wrote. So that's transcription, and translation is quite a separate thing. Translation is translating from one language to another. So, and we all know, we're confronted with it in daily life with certain things. But certainly Bible translation was written in Hebrew / Aramaic for the Old Testament, and Greek in the New Testament. So we're English speaking, so we're relying on translations.
So it's translations we're talking about rather than transcription, which is a different subject, an interesting subject, but probably a topic for another day.
Yeah.
So let's get to the most obvious question, which we get anyone could ask, and that is there a perfect translation? Just give me the best translation. Give me the right one. That would be the simple question.
Yeah. And that's the thing. We all wish there was. It's just unbelievably complex question. And the short answer is no, there is none that is perfect. So they all have different ways of philosophies of translating. Just simply, words don't have perfect matches from one language to another. The Germans have a couple of words or they have very few words for big or grand. So they might say, "Das ist ein großes Auto," which means that is a big car. But then they'll use the same word, gross, for their grandmother. Das ist ein Großmutter, and doesn't translate, that is my big mother.
Right.
Probably get you in a little bit of trouble with your mother or grandmother. But so there's no just direct equivalent.
So you can't just translate word for word because you end up in a mess.
No, that's right. So you just simply can't do that. There aren't direct equivalents across translations. Then there's another problem that you've got, and that's idiom. So, we all know idiom. I've got a frog in my throat. I'm killing time. It's raining cats and dogs. Are you pulling my leg? That kind of stuff just does not translate well. Explain killing time to a new Australian, and they'll just think you're pretty violent, or it won't make sense. In fact, the French say, "I've got a cat in my throat." So just doesn't translate well. We wouldn't know what a Frenchman meant if it was translated directly. In fact, in Amos 4 verse 6, there's a really good example where God says, "I gave you cleanness of teeth," which a literal translation, which we're going to get to the difference between literal and less literal, a literal translation will translate it, I gave you cleanness of teeth. And that is idiomatic for I gave you empty stomachs. You can see the connection there. But
right, so one translation will say, they'll translate, "I gave you cleanness of teeth." That would be a literal translation. And then you've got one who, I guess, what would you say? It almost interprets it for you.
Yeah, it does a bit of interpreting. But I must say, all translations have to do some interpreting, so there's no getting away from it. And I think the important thing, and this is where we're headed, the important thing to understand is there is sort of like a spectrum of how much interpreting gets done.
So we end up having to make this choice between a literal translation that leaves the interpretation of the idioms and so on to us, so that sort of leaves us with a bunch of work to do, which obviously is quite, you could argue, quite then difficult to read just as a reading reference sort of thing. Or you can then look for a more interpretive style that sort of interprets all of that for you and just gives you the meaning and is therefore quite easy to read. You just read through it and get a sense of what's being said.
Yeah, that's exactly it, and it probably goes even more so where to the sort of more extreme end of the spectrum, where you get a complete paraphrase, a lot of interpretation, not so much translation. In fact, you wouldn't call it a translation. Probably the best favour anyone can do for themselves if they're looking sort of at this, and it is a really important subject, and it's a easy thing to do, is just Google Bible translation spectrum, and what you will get is you'll get a chart, and they're all very similar. They'll have different sort of dividing lines between them. But what they'll all have in common is at the extreme left-hand end of the chart, they all look like this. At the left-hand end of the chart is very conservative, like a in fact, interlinear, which is completely unreadable. I don't know if anyone's tried to look at the words in a diaglot, and it's just utterly unreadable. Then as you move across to the right, you will get translations like the New American, the Amplified, the ESV, RSV, KJV, NKJV. They're all translations that are readable, but trying to be what is called essentially literal or word for word. They're trying to stay as close as they can to the original without imposing too much interpretation onto the reader.
So that's really important for us if we like word studies and things like that, because this is the trouble with sort of moving across the spectrum. You lose the ability to do word studies and see connections between different parts of the Bible because you're losing those literal words and those connections.
Oh, that's absolutely right. And so a literal translation will do things like try to use the same word, same Greek word, and copy an English word through. You can't always do that, and all translations will break that rule to one degree or another. But the conservative translations will try to stay as literal as possible. Where necessary, do some interpreting, where as you move to the right of this spectrum, it becomes a matter of course to do interpretation, a matter of choice. So as you move across this spectrum, you come across, and some of these translations your listeners will be familiar with, the NIV, perhaps the TNIV, the New American Bible. They're sort of to the right of the conservative translations. So they, what would you say?
So these are more thought for thought rather than word for word.
Yes, and that's the actual words that are used, thought for thought. So they're saying, look, we're trying to tell you what we think John is thinking. You can see the obvious danger there. While these people are scholars, and I'm going to say, 95% of the time, get it right.
Yeah.
You are putting the interpretation in their hands, and that's probably the danger. But brilliant for like the one we saw in Amos. Brilliant for bringing out what the idiom means. So cleanness of teeth, you could be scratching your head over that for weeks. Then someone just says, bang, empty stomach. I know what that means. So really useful. In fact, I'm going to say the NIV is my favourite second translation because it's got a lot of scholarly work behind it, committees working on it, Trinitarian bias thrown in, but that's a given. So they're the things you have to be cautious of, but really useful. But for me, not my main Bible.
And then so we're going from word for word, thought for thought.
Yep.
And then what would you call the ones on the far right?
The other side of the spectrum, you'd say paraphrase, and this is where it's really it is paraphrase. You could call it commentary.
Right.
It is, at times I would describe it as not a Bible. And it is a blurred line going from across this spectrum. There are some points that you could probably put dividing lines and say, we've crossed the line here, but it's not always that clear. Clearly something like the Message is very much in the paraphrase. You are reading the opinions of Eugene Peterson. Absolutely no doubt about that.
To be fair to the Message Bible, one of the things I've read the foreword of the Message Bible, and I encourage everyone who uses the Message Bible to go and read the foreword.
Yeah,
because he actually makes that statement in the foreword.
Yes.
He's not pretending to be a translation, and in fact, he says once you've learned a bit about the Bible and you've got some interest, he goes, go and get a decent translation. He actually says that in the foreword of his own book.
Yeah, no, I think kudos to him for saying that, and that is the right thing to say because it is a paraphrase. And it's funny because there's two different opinions. He says this is designed to entice you into reading the Bible and then go get a proper one. One scholar I was looking at said, use the Message once you are grounded. So he says the exact opposite. I'm actually not even, and this is a personal thing, no offense to the Message readers out there, but I really struggle with some of the stuff in there.
Yeah, so you would, well, that's probably a good segue into what you recommend then. So you mentioned the NIV as your second Bible.
For my first Bible, and this is, again, I'm not the guru, but I think, and a lot of people would agree with me, this has got a lot of agreement, even on the net. Your first Bible is often best to be a literal translation, like a KJV, NKJV, RV, New American. I used a New American for 35 years. I've shifted to the ESV, which is also an excellent conservative translation, word for word style. The NIV is kind of the next step across the line. It is actually in the thought for thought, or they call dynamic equivalent, is another phrase for it. It's very tight as a translation, like it's not particularly sloppy. Again, you'll get biases in there. There's a beauty in Philippians 2, who Jesus being very God,
Right.
it's not even a particularly good translation, but apart from that, it's great in Romans. It's
Helps you see the flow of thought and the argument and so on.
Yes, exactly.
I was curious, so having a look at this spectrum, which you mentioned before, which you can grab on Google, I would have just assumed the King James Version would be way over on the left with not much, left of the King James. But actually, you mentioned the ESV, the RSV, the Amplified Bible, and the New American Standard Bible are all considered, on this diagram anyway, to be more literal, more word for word than the King James Version. That surprises me.
Yeah, it is a little bit of a surprise. To be honest, these charts vary a little. So often you'll see...
Right, so a little bit open to interpretation.
Absolutely. But there is one consistent thing that I have never... Someone could probably show me an exception, but the New American Standard is always at the more conservative end of that grouping. So the ESV and the KJV might swap positions.
Right.
My personal opinion, I think the ESV is probably slightly looser than the KJV, but that's my personal opinion.
That's what I would have assumed.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if I entirely agree with, and these are nuances we're talking about here. So these translations are grouped very closely together. But there is a little bit of variation in the nuance, but the New American probably, of all the mainstream Bibles, would be the most literal translation, to the point of being a little clunky. It gets criticised for being clunky. It does things like doesn't distinguish between cities and towns because there's only one Greek word, I understand, for those. So, Jesus will go to something that is a hamlet and it gets described as a city.
Yep.
So all translations have got their problems, and that's...
I don't actually mind that because it challenges to learn a little bit about even knowing that. I think it's actually a useful thing to know. And once you know it, you read it accordingly.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Personal opinion, I suppose. But
yeah. Each translation's got their problems. We've all grown up, at least originally with the KJV. We all know the KJV problems. As a community, need to learn the issues with the newer translations because they've all got them, and it's just a learning thing.
Let's have a look at some of the examples of where things can vary between translations, just to get because we've been talking fairly academically. Is there a couple of examples that you can give us where it can just illustrate the point a bit?
Yeah. So I've sort of done a bit of looking at this, and in Romans 5 verse 10, the New American says, "For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God." So this is a fairly tight translation, as I've said. The New American: If while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of His Son. It's a bit much to take in if you're just listening. Much more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved by His life. So you've got that word reconciled. It's a very biblical word, rich in meaning. The Niv follows through. For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to Him. You get to the New Living Translation, which I'm moving across the spectrum from the left, conservative, across to the right, which is looser translation. For since our friendship with God was restored by the death of His Son. So you're starting to, you're losing this scripture.
It doesn't sound right, does it?
No.
Friendship.
No, friendship.
I guess friendship has been restored.
it's almost sentimentalized.
Yeah.
And then the message, and this is what frustrates me with the message. It says for when we were at our worst, we were put on friendly terms. So it's I think it's sort of going the next step again. And then I think what's worse, it says, so we'll put on friendly terms with God by the sacrificial death of his son. Now that we're at our best, like we're at our best, this is about reconciliation.
There's like nothing in that verse you agree with.
Yeah, that's right. It's about grace. And it talks about us being at our best, like it's just lost.
So this is where you're saying before the more you go into the interpretive and the paraphrase, you're at the mercy of someone's view on the atonement, their view on our relationship with God, etc. And that's what comes out here.
Yeah. I think the message tends to secularize deeply Christian concepts and turn them into something that you could show to a work colleague and they would be pretty cool with it, even if they maintain their atheism or whatever. In fact it does that with the fruits of the Spirit, which we can have a look at if you...
Well, that's an interesting one. What's that? Galatians 5:22.
Yes. So, typical translation, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness. The NIV sort of changes that a bit. The NLT, so I've sort of done a comparison between 4 translations, but as you move across, it becomes more and more sort of plain English. But the Message Bible, the verse is really big. Suddenly the verse is 3 times its size. It talks about exuberance for life, serenity, a willingness to stick with things, So that one is, I think, perseverance, a solidly Christian biblical concept, willingness to stick with things. What are we talking about? Uni? It's... So I guess I've probably gone on enough about the message, but I think there's just warnings with it, and I do understand, scholars say, it has its place and it's useful, so I don't want to be completely reject it.
Well, you mentioned the NIV.
Yep.
You think that's a reasonable translation to give the sense. So let's go back to our spectrum again. It's somewhat in the middle, thought for thought, although not too far to the right.
Yep.
What is it about the NIV you like, and what do we need to look out for?
So, the NIV, interpretive, but very limited in its interpretation. It is very good with idiom. It's excellent with idiom.
Okay.
Most of the time it will be right. An unusual phrase in your ESV or your KJV or something like that, go to the NIV and it will tend to clarify.
Okay, so let me jump in. So when you talk about your first Bible and your second Bible, is that what you're saying? You're saying you'll tend to use a New American or something like that, and then if you've got a question, you'll head to the NIV to see if it can give you a bit more of an interpretive and give you a bit of an understanding of what it's saying. Is that what you mean by? Absolutely.
I also do use it for reading often. Like it's the Bible on my phone too. So
right.
And there will be sometimes I'm reading away and I'll realise I'm reading a verse that I kind of don't recognise, which is sort of almost exciting. It's always good to go back and check, but it might be a point that you've actually missed.
Because one translation sort of emphasises or brings out an idea that you didn't notice in a different translation.
Yeah. So, and with some of the examples I had before, the fruits of the Spirit, it's really good. Often with a simple list like that, it will tend to be much the same as a conservative translation. But certainly with arguments like Romans, Galatians, it's very good at making the argument, hearing Paul's argument. You can hear his voice. Again, I always say, of course, use caution, but it's very good in that regard. So there's a bit of caution. One area that it's been criticised for, and this is one of the things that it'll tend to. One example is it interprets the word flesh for you. So flesh again is a very strong word in Scripture. It can mean nor did his, and I'm just going to rattle off a few verses from the ESV. Nor did his flesh see corruption. We know what that means. Literally, his flesh didn't see corruption. And all flesh shall see the salvation of God. That's all humanity.
Yeah, but it sort of has. I mean, it could have said all people will see, but when it says all flesh, there's something a bit more raw about what that's saying. It's just slightly deeper than saying everyone's going to be saved or everyone's going to see salvation. It means a bit more, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's it, and that's the thing. It's a word that's bringing with it a lot of richness of meaning, and to lose that connection is sort of a problem with the NIF. So ESV again. My kinsman according to the flesh. That's Paul in Romans 9 verse 3, talking about his brothers, his Jewish brothers. But then in Romans 8, you get the full richness of this flesh idea. For God has done what the law, weakened by the flesh, could not do, by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and for sin he condemned sin in the flesh. So that's you've got this whole broad nuance of meaning, means so much, and then what the NIV does with each of those four verses I referred to, nor did his body see decay. All people will see God's salvation, those of my own race. And then in Romans 8 verse 3, his own son, in the likeness of sinful man, to be a sin offering, and so he condemned sin in sinful man. And it's just sort of made a bit of a muddle of an obscured a connection. And that's the big thing with the word flesh. It's an example of where it's an idiomatic word or a technical word that isn't unique to Greek and Hebrew, but it's unique to the Bible. It's like an idiom that God himself put there. In fact, that is the case. I don't think you would hear a Greek person walking around using flesh, back in the days of Paul, the same way, where...
Yeah, so it's a good thing to remember. So these are the actual words that were inspired by God.
Yes.
And so let's not replace them with our own sort of concepts too readily.
Yes. I think that's the most important thing to remember with translation. It's God's word. When we do interpretation, I'd like to know what's going on. And ESV, you read flesh, you do the interpreting. NIV, they do the interpreting for you.
Yeah, I agree. We probably need to get back to the King James version. There'd be a bunch of people listening who have grown up using the King James and have always used the King James. And of course, for centuries, it was really the only accessible version. What do you think of the King James?
The King James has been the benchmark for 400 years, up until probably for a good 300 years. It was the only translation. It's an excellent translation in that it is in what I consider to be at the right part of the translation spectrum. It tries to be conservative, tries to reveal God's word as it is. It maintains the sentence structure and things like that. It's even considered in the world a piece of literature outside of Christianity. I've done a lot of viewing of scholars and professors, and they will all say the KJV has a grandeur that many other translations don't. The ESV is probably in the similar mold in that sense. It was designed for public reading. So it is good in that sense. I personally, and there are many people who just read the KJV like they'd read a book.
Yep.
For me, I struggle with the Old English. I find it very difficult. And that is not because the KJV translators were deficient. I'd like to think it's not because of my IQ. I think it is simply because over 400 years, language changes a real lot. And I think, that's where where the problem for me is.
Language has changed, and I notice even when I read the King James that there's certain words which you read and think, oh, that's a funny word to use in that spot, and you look at it and think, oh, well, it's changed its meaning and we use it differently today.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the almost traps with the KJV to some degree. So there's the words that you know you don't know, concupiscence,
Right.
even heretofore. I've been doing a informal survey, and I asked people, what does heretofore mean? I kid you not, out of the 30 people I've probably asked, 2 knew what it meant. And maybe that's a little bit unfair.
Yeah, because you're asking them out of context.
Yeah. But even then, someone says, well, can you put it in a sentence for me? And I now say, well, you put it in a sentence. Because a word you understand easily, you can easily do that.
Yeah.
And that is nothing to do with them. It's just heretofore doesn't get used. And it means up until now. I can't do this survey anymore because I've just blown it. But it's a problem. So that's one of the problems, that the words that you know you don't know, and you've got to go away and look up. But there's the words you think you know, but you don't know. For example, how long will you halt between two opinions? I know what that means. It means stop. That's what halt means. Well, it doesn't. 400 years ago, it meant lame. So, there's words that you'll just get, a peculiar. You are my peculiar people. I mean, that sounds a bit strange. So you look it up and it means a person's private property. But, what about suffer the little ones to see me? That means permit.
Right.
There's quite a few words that, in fact, one that particularly caught my attention is honest, worthy of honour, not honest as in doesn't tell lies. So, there's times when it is just difficult. And I think that's part of the problem, or probably really the only problem in a lot of ways, apart from the problems that the KJV has along with every other translation. But
I think, speaking for myself, I've been reading the King James for 40 years. So I only really, I think I probably got used to it. So I only notice it when I'm talking to somebody else who's not used to it. And you can just see you're in two different places.
Oh, yeah. And it's...
So for preaching and things like that, I definitely reach for a different translation.
Absolutely. And our young people is sometimes what I worry about. I've been with younger people and asked them to read a verse. Okay, what'd you read there? And they're just stunned. They don't know how to describe it. And it's simply because they don't understand it. And, I guess we could get them to do a 40-year apprenticeship. And I guess the question is there a good reason not to use other good translations? I think that's the nub of the question with this. And I respect people who can understand the KJV far better than I can. And I do know many people who read it fluently.
Well, we mentioned before there are newer translations that are still on the left of the spectrum, still word for word, but there are objections to them. I think some people say they're still a bit sloppy, if you like, and you've mentioned a couple of examples. Some people say they lack the grandeur of the actual English. Some people think that's actually a good thing. It's respectful or something like that. The subject of manuscripts, I think we should talk about that. We'll come back to that.
Yep.
But let's just talk about some of those sort of more general reasons people have to stick with the King James.
Yeah, so I think there is a little bit of misunderstanding. So translators of, the objection translators of the modern Bibles are sloppy. And, you hear people use the Message as an example. Well, I would wholeheartedly agree. People use even the NIV, which is right at the very conservative end of the thought for thought spectrum. They'll point out problems with that. Wholeheartedly agree. But there are excellent, very tight translations. Sure, and I agree, they have their biases, and we need to, as a community, educate ourselves on the problems with the KJV. NKJV is another one. Excellent translation.
Yeah, I hear a lot of people using that now.
Yeah.
Actually, it just occurs to me, going back to the earlier years of those apprenticeships, if you wanted to do word studies and wanted to actually study the Bible, if you like, so you were using Strong's words, etc., you almost had to use the King James Version because a lot of the other versions weren't key to Strong's and you didn't have that facility.
Yes.
Whereas now with the electronic Bibles, they're standardizing a lot of that across other Bibles as well. So you can use a different translation and still, probably to a lesser extent, to be fair, and I don't do it. I do stick with the King James, so I'm not the best one to talk about it. But you can still use reference materials and so on with the other translations now, at least to some extent.
Oh, absolutely. I believe some of I can't remember if it's the ESV or the New American, actually has an exhaustive concordance in the mold of Strong's. To be honest, I still do, and have in the past always had a KJV handy if I was doing that kind of study. Yes, it's a disadvantage. I will admit that, but probably a very small portion of your reading time is spent doing that kind of study, and it's just one extra little step.
Yeah, sure. And back to what you were saying before, you have a range of Bibles for the different things you're doing.
Yeah, exactly.
So within this group of translations, there's slightly different philosophies around the manuscripts that are used. We hear that talked about. So there's different groups of manuscripts that are used for the different translations, and some have a preference here. Just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so when you start talking about manuscripts, you've gone from the position of talking about translation, and you're now talking about transcription. So what's happened is we currently now have, and I'm going to ignore the Old Testament here because the Old Testament really only has the Dead Sea Scrolls off the top of my head and the Masoretic, and they are excellent, and there's not much debate around those. So I'll put that aside for now. But in the New Testament, we've got about 5,000 manuscripts of the New Testament, ranging from manuscript fragments to whole New Testaments, just about. Manuscripts in other languages, it goes up to about, so they're Greek manuscripts, sorry. And then manuscripts translated from Greek into Latin, Syriac, etc., etc. You're talking 20,000. That is an unbelievable embarrassment of riches, as a lot of scholars describe it as. It's no other ancient document has that kind of manuscriptural evidence behind it.
So did you say it's an embarrassment?
Yeah, an embarrassment of riches. That's the word they.
Embarrassment of riches. Okay.
Yeah, it's so that's not my word, but I've heard it from a few scholars.
It's certainly important to be aware of, isn't it? Because you often hear people say, well, I don't even, it's a throwaway line. I don't even know if the Bible I'm reading was exactly what was written back 2,000 years anyway. And of course, the argument is we have a very good argument to demonstrate that we're very sure that it's very accurate.
Oh, absolutely. So you've got so much to work with, so that and then they do things like emphasize the differences between them, but the difference between the manuscripts are very, very small. In fact, there's a Bart Ehrman. He's was a Christian scholar. He was, I believe, might have done his doctorate in textual understanding, and now he's an atheist, and he's a formidable debater, and he debates with Christians, and he admits, not readily, but has admitted that no major Christian doctrine is affected by the differences in all of these manuscripts. So it's a real.
So the biggest difference is not substantial.
No, there are differences. They've nailed it down to probably 0.25% of the Bible, of the New Testament, has any significant differences. Not even significant. They're being very, very critical when they say this. They will say things like, Jesus Christ to the Lord Jesus Christ. That would be included in significant. And that kind of error is 0.25%. There's some other more significant differences, which I don't think we'll have time to go through. But that aside, what I've said about Bart Ehrman and the differences, there still is a little bit of controversy. It's actually not a lot of controversy out there in the scholarly world. Most scholars would agree on on one major textual family. Just backpedaling a little bit, there are probably four main. So of those 5,000 manuscripts, there are probably four main families. In fact, probably really three. There's the Western family, very old, but generally agreed by all scholars to be unreliable. Then you've got the Byzantine family of manuscripts. So this is getting a little bit technical. This is a huge subject, but this is a thumbnail sketch. The Byzantine family of manuscripts date from the 5th century through to the 1400s, which is where you sort of stop, because that's when the printing press started.
So presumably they were sort of through the Orthodox Christian world,
Absolutely.
passed on through that area.
Yes. So the Byzantine is easily the most prolific of the texts that are used. The Byzantine family of copies, that forms the basis of what the King James was translated from. So there's
okay. So just to be clear, the King James is based on the Byzantine group of manuscripts.
Correct, and that is the most prolific. But there's another factor that comes into play in the next one, and that's the Alexandrian. So the Alexandrian is not the most prolific. There's a couple of hundred copies of it, but what it has going for it is the oldest. It's the 2nd century. In fact, there's a portion of John that dates to 125 AD, which is just after it was written. That is understood to be in the Alexandrian family.
So Alexandrian in the sense of the Jewish and the Christian community down in North Egypt?
Yes.
That's named after that area?
Yep. So you've probably got two main contenders, and I'll even ignore the Caesarean. It's not even a family. So you've really got three main families, two that are in contention. So there are people out there who believe that the Byzantine is the only text that is right. In fact, they'll go further and say the Textus Receptus is the only text that is right. So we're probably so the Textus Receptus, what that is a text that was compiled from some Byzantine manuscripts, if that makes sense. So what happens when you're a translator, you don't put in front of yourself 5,000 manuscripts and work your way through them. You'll use basically what I'm going to describe as a pre-done, pre-compiled,
like a summary.
Absolutely,
a consensus.
Yeah, a consensus. So what on the one hand, you've got the Textus Receptus, which forms the basis of the KJV, NKJV, and a few others. And then you've got the Alexandrian, another thing which is called the Nestle Aland, or the Bible Society. There's two different compilations there, and they're based on the Alexandrian. So the argument is, one side says we've got the most text, the Textus Receptus says there's 5,000, and the Alexandrians say, no, these are the oldest. The absolute overwhelming majority of scholars would say that the Alexandrian is the more reliable, mainly because it's the oldest, but for many other reasons. They've got a lot of reasons why they sort of have come to this conclusion.
But it's open to corruption because you've got a lot less copies, and that's the counter argument, I guess.
There are less copies, but there's even the less copies is interesting when you look at this piece of information. So the Byzantine text is prolific only if you start at the 10th century. So so if you lived at the 10th century, if you chopped out everything from the 10th century onwards, the Alexandrian text is actually the majority text. There's more Alexandrian text predating 10th century. So Alexandrian text has a stronger ancient attestation. And part of where some of the objections, and I guess we're going back to the idea that the modern translations, which are mostly based on the Alexandrian Nestle Aland text, the main objection, one of the objections is the motivation of the scholars. And I've heard painted that the idea painted that these guys are sitting behind closed doors and saying, what can we change to suit our doctrine or philosophy in life. I watched hours of material on textual criticism, and these guys are scholarly. They have exactly the same view as us on inspiration. They believe it's the word of God. These people are extremely respectful. So from the early days where the Byzantine, the Textus Receptus was put together. So the Textus Receptus was put together by a Catholic monk called Erasmus, Desiderius Erasmus, in the 1500s. He was a scholar, and he did the best he could with the information he had. One of the other myths I've heard is that Erasmus had thousands of manuscripts. He had 8, and he probably used about 3 of those. Erasmus had, of those 8 copies of the New Testament that he had, only one had revelation, and that was missing the last 6 verses. So he wasn't working with a particularly brilliant set of data, but he was a brilliant scholar, and he did put together the Textus Receptus that was revised over the years, and that became the basis of the KJV. So that's one of the things that people say, that the Textus Receptus is the best. The overwhelming majority of scholars would disagree with that, and the scholars that are critiquing these ancient manuscripts are very scholarly.
So just to sort of put a bit of example here, so this is where you might read the King James Version and then read the ESV, both which are fairly literal translations.
Yes.
And there's decent difference between what you're reading between the two translations. And so it's not necessarily because of a translation per se. It could be because there's a slight difference in the original set of texts they're translating from.
Correct. So, and there's a tendency to harmonise. So Gospels tend to, in the Textus Receptus or the KJV, have more harmonisations in the Gospels, and the scholars understand that to be because a scribe is scribing it down, and he remembers.
So you got a chunk of Mark missing out of the King James, ESV,
there's that kind of thing. So think explanatory notes. The angel that disturbed the water is in the KJV. That's in one of the Gospels. That is believed to be an explanatory footnote that found its way into the text.
Right.
Another example would be Paul. There's 4 records of Paul's conversion. He talks about the kicking against the pricks. I think in the KJV, all 4 records of that conversion include that phrase. In the ESV, you'll find only one of them will, but that is, the Textus Receptus tends to be fuller, and they believe that is because of harmonisations. I mean, there will be people who disagree with me, but I'm probably repeating what, like I say, the overwhelming majority of textual critics will say. And unfortunately, we have to rely on the experts to some degree. We are not experts.
And we're certainly not going to go and read 5,000 copies.
No, that's right.
Now, very old in my back of my brain, a long way back, Westcott and Hort.
Yes.
Who are they and where are they?
So Westcott and Hort are the first guys who put together the manuscript, the Greek text compiled from the Alexandrian. Right. So they're about 1850, 1880.
Right.
They get, one of them had some connection with, this is the kind of ad hominem arguments you get. He had some connection with the occult. And I think it wasn't even true. Erasmus, on the other hand, if we're going to be critical, I think Erasmus was a great scholar. Erasmus, on one hand, was a Catholic scholar. He wrote a treatise on transubstantiation. So,
and that's to be expected from a Catholic. The Byzantine works is going to be the Orthodox people. So, but I have heard people strongly argue against the Westcott and Hort school of thinking, and that's really just an argument between sort of the large amount of manuscripts and the smaller group, but the older ones. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's Westcott. So what's happened? Westcott and Hort. What they use now is Nestle-Aland. So from Westcott and Hort have come two branches, which is Nestle-Aland and the Bible Society Bible, and they're both Greek manuscripts, but they are largely based on Westcott and Hort. Westcott and Hort were just controversial because they rejected the Textus Receptus, and they say things like the Byzantine manuscripts and the Textus Receptus isn't even a particularly good version of the Byzantine text. I think one of the books defending the KJV says the Textus Receptus is not a particularly a rather corrupt form of the Byzantine text. So it's not even a good version of that.
So in all of this, again, we probably always need to keep reminding ourselves, and those that are listening, that we're talking about just those minute number of disputed sort of little sections of verses or and a lot of the quite subtle nuances in verses.
Yeah. So some of it is tiny. So most of it is untranslatable. They say it's actually untranslatable. You get this one, get that. You couldn't translate them differently.
Right. So the difference is lost in the translation.
Yeah, absolutely, literally. Your big one is long ending of Mark, and John 8. John 8 is a woman caught in adultery, so it's called pericope adulterae. So that's probably where it gets tricky. My answer to that probably would be that I don't know a Bible that doesn't include it. It'll have a note. So you look at an ESV and it'll have a note. One of the other things that also gets put forward as a defense of the KJV, and I'm not against defending the KJV so much as saying it's the only translation that is reliable, and it is the only translation that should be used. That's where I would have an objection. Like I say, I reckon it's a great translation. But one of the objections is that the KJV is very grand, and the Old English, it's not just the Old English, it was written to be a grand translation. But I think what has always fascinated me is the fact that and I understand this to be true, any of the literati at the time of Paul would have written in Attic Greek or ancient Greek, but they didn't. They wrote in Koine Greek, which is the colloquial Greek. So even at the time of the writing of the New Testament, the Greek chosen was the common man's Greek.
So very much written so that every person could read and understand.
Absolutely.
You didn't have to be a learned scholar to get the message.
That's it. As Tyndale said, the ploughman,
right.
It's a Bible for the ploughman. I think it was Tyndale. And there's a stack of words, about 400 words, I think, in the New Testament that were not seen outside of the New Testament for a long time, simply because the ancient Greek manuscripts that people read, that scholars read, were the literati types articles. When they started digging into common letters between a man and his wife, or a business person and his colleague, all these New Testament words started surfacing, which I think is fascinating in itself. It was the everyday language. It was the language it was a written language, of course, but I think that's the important thing. We all understand it.
All right. Well, that's a good addition. Thank you. Well, we've covered a good deal of ground, and no doubt there's many more layers we could get into. I can definitely see that. But perhaps let's just circle around, summarize sort of where we've come from, and just get some sort of summary advice from yourself on how we can take advantage of sort of what you could argue is our benefit. We have this assortment and choice in different styles of translations.
Yeah, I think we have really been blessed with multiple translations. Like I've probably said enough times, your home Bible is better to be a literal or more literal, essentially literal, they call it, translation. And you've got this wealth of other looser translations, more interpretive translations to work with. I think one of the things I find, the best way to find a meaning of a word in a particular context is not so much going to Strong's or even a lexicon. is looking at other translators, because we don't know Greek. And you go to Strong's and that word might have 5 different meanings. So which one applies? So that's the big advantage that we have with this wealth of translations. So I think it's important to understand what the different translations are. I can't emphasize that enough. Then you know what you're doing as a reader. I don't want to. I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination, but a lot of people would agree with me on that. And then you go to your J.B. Phillips, your New Living Translation, and they can be extremely helpful. The Niv, of course. So, and I think one other thought is we need to be Christ-like in our discussion. I think robust discussion on this subject is great because it's a subject we all care deeply about, and we'd be worse for it if we didn't care about it. But if we're Christ-like, rational, reasonable, we can work together as a community through this translation discussion.
So just finishing up, can I summarise by saying you recommend the King James Version, the New American Standard Version?
Yep.
The New King James Version, which is obviously based on the King James with sort of a slightly more modern slant.
Yep.
And then you would go to the ESV as well to get an alternative, and that gives you different manuscripts as well, if that's important.
Yeah, or ESV. Sorry, I'd use the ones listed, including the ESV, as a sort of a home-based Bible. Incidentally, when it comes to the manuscripts, if you really do want the Textus Receptus, the New King James uses the Textus Receptus. So if you're that way inclined, there's an option.
Paul, I think that's really helpful and great to get us thinking about the translations. And I think it's just worth finishing with the idea of how blessed we are to have this book in front of us that was written thousands of years ago, and to be confident that we have what was actually written, and then with a reliable translation so that we can understand it today, which is extraordinary when you think about it.
Oh, absolutely. So many people that for a long time haven't had that blessing.
Thanks for joining Wilderness Conversations.
No worries. Thanks, Steve.